Senesret III watched the desert sunrise from the prow of his war barge as it slid southward along the Nile, the rippling reflection of the sky, turning the river into a molten path, guiding him toward the lands that had defied Egypt for generations. Nubia was beautiful. Yes, a sweep of golden dunes and jagged cliffs that rose like ancient teeth, but it was also treacherous, rich with people who bowed to no foreign king. For years, they had struck at caravans, plundered traders, and tested Egypt's southern settlements. Senesret, newly ascended yet already iron in spirit, had no intention of allowing chaos to gnaw at the edges of his realm. He intended to carve order itself into the granite bones of the frontier. Whispers among his commanders claimed the king dreamed of a chain of fortresses that would stitch Egypt's southern border into a single living organism, each bastion feeding the next with information, soldiers, signals, and resolve. 12 forts, some said, positioned like carved chess pieces along the cataracts, and canals that could cut the river to command its moods. Even a dam, some radical construction the king's engineers claimed would outlast generations, the oldest structure of its kind the world had seen. These were not mere fortifications. They were a strategy, a new kind of warfare, a real-time lattice of power. But Senesret saw more than walls. He saw movement, intelligence, speed, the beating heart of an empire that would react to threats faster than any enemy could comprehend. His generals, hardened men accustomed to the slow pace of desert marches, struggled to grasp what he demanded. That war be fought with precision, with infrastructure, with mastery over terrain itself. The Nubians fought with ferocity and cunning, using the desert as their ally. Very well, Senesret thought. Then he would make the desert his instrument. His barge glided past the first construction site, where dozens of laborers carved into the bedrock to lay foundations. The chief architect, Anku, stood waiting on the shore and bowed deeply as the king approached. "The stone is stubborn, Majesty," Anku said, "but it yields." Senesret stepped onto the sand, boots sinking into the hot grains as he surveyed the skeletal beginnings of the fortress. "It must do more than yield," he replied. "It must obey. The border will not hold without obedience from every stone, every riverbank, every soldier." Anku nodded, though sweat beaded on his brow. "We have begun cutting the sluice passages for the canal, as you ordered. When finished, we will be able to manipulate the river height for both transport and defense." Senesret felt a spark of satisfaction. The canal networks were essential. With them, he could ferry troops between forts faster than any army in Nubia could react. The forts were not isolated structures, they were nodes, connected through water and signal towers. Real-time adaptation, Senesret mused. A living border, but living things required vigilance and blood. As the sun climbed higher, a horn call echoed from the southern dunes. A scout, breathless, kneeled before the king. "Majesty, the Sea Group clans have mobilized near the third cataract. They are preparing raiding parties." Senesret's jaw tightened. It was as he expected. Nubian resistance flared whenever Egypt built too deeply into the frontier. Good. Let them gather. Let them believe Egypt's hand was still slow and predictable. He turned to his commanders. "Activate the relay. I want the garrisons at Semna and Kuma alerted before the sun reaches its peak." The commanders hesitated. Semna and Kuma were days away by standard message bearers. But Senesret lifted a hand, and workers ran to the half-built signal tower. A polished copper disc caught the sun. Moments later, flashes of light danced across the desert, bouncing from tower to tower like shards of brilliance. Within minutes, the message would reach the southern forts. The generals stared, as if witnessing sorcery. "Majesty," one whispered, "with this network, we can see and respond faster than any force on Earth." "Exactly," Senesret said. "We will not merely conquer Nubia. We will outthink it." Days later, the king traveled deeper south, where the river narrowed and churned between jagged cliffs that formed the great bottlenecks of the cataracts. Here, His engineers labored to redirect the river's fury, carving channels into stone to craft the world's first dam. It was a monstrous undertaking, hundreds of men hauling granite blocks, dozens carving mathematical markings into tablets, priests murmuring blessings to ensure the Nile would not rise in anger. Anku approached with a clay model of the structure. "Majesty, we believe the dam will permit controlled flooding on command. With this, we can starve enemy encampments along the banks or flood their escape routes." "Good," Senesret said. "Force them to face us directly, not skulk along hidden river paths." But as he surveyed the chaotic construction site, a thin figure in desert garb stepped from between the blocks. A Nubian emissary, flanked by guards. His dark eyes reflected both fear and fierce pride. "King of Kemet," the emissary said, bowing only slightly. End quote. End quote. "Your forts rise like thorns in the flesh of my people. Why do you push so deeply into lands that do not belong to you?" Senesret studied him. "Because chaos festers here. Raids disrupt the peace of the two lands. Trade is strangled. Stability must be carved from disorder." The emissary's gaze hardened. "Your stability is our ruin. The Nubian people do not need Egyptian order." Senesret stepped closer. "If your people threaten mine, we will reshape this land until it obeys. But you may leave with this choice: resist and be swept aside, or join our order and prosper under it." The emissary's expression flickered, but his pride held. "We choose neither. We will fight." He turned, vanishing into the shifting dunes as if swallowed by the desert itself. Senesret watched him go, a cold certainty settling in his chest. "Then we will build faster," he murmured. Work resumed with renewed urgency. The king moved from site to site, personally inspecting every stone, every ramp of earth, every canal trench. Soldiers drilled in formations tailored for desert warfare, rapid deployment units, river skirmishers, archers trained to fire from fortress ramparts angled to maximize range. Fortresses rose: Semna, Kuma, Uronarti, Shafak, Askut, each one unique, each one a cog in the living border machine. When the chain neared completion, a strange quiet settled over the frontier. The Nubian raiders faded from sight. Too quiet, Senesret realized on a silent evening as the horizon burned red. War had not vanished. It was simply waiting, and he intended to strike first. Senesret III rode at the head of his vanguard as it swept south into the narrowing gorge, where the Nile funneled between cliffs like a blade's edge. The heat pressed down with the weight of a god's hand. Yet the king felt only the cold clarity of intent. The forts behind him, 12 stone sentinels gripping the desert, like anchors, were ready. Signals flashed from tower to tower behind him, relaying troop movements in near real time. Supply barges slipped through the newly cut canals, gliding on redirected currents, their prows loaded with grain, arrows, and fresh troops. The entire frontier pulsed like a single organism under his command. The Nubians knew this, which meant they would strike before the border fully solidified. Senesret planned to meet them in territory they believed unassailable. Scouts slithered through the ravines ahead, sending back coated bursts of reflected sunlight. Enemy movement detected, numbers uncertain. Senesret urged his chariot forward. The Nile roared beside the army, churning white as it smashed itself against the rocks. On the far bank, the unfinished dam rose like the bones of some primordial beast, its colossal arches half-carved, its retaining walls reaching for the sky. Within days it would be complete, and the river would obey the king's will. But today, it remained vulnerable, and so did Egypt's ambitions. At noon, the Nubians emerged from the cliffs. Hundreds at first lean warriors with ostrich feather plumes swaying from their helms. Then more, shadows pouring from ravines like a living tide. Their war cries split the air, echoing off stone walls until the canyon itself seemed to scream. Arrows darkened the sky. Egyptian shields snapped into position as Senesret raised his hand. signaling formations drilled in the shadow of the new forts. Lines shifted instantly. Archers dropped to one knee. Spearmen raised their bronze-tipped pikes, and above them, signal mirrors flashed orders upstream, invisible to the enemy but critical to the unfolding chaos. The Nubians charged. Fast, agile, fearless. They slammed against the Egyptian front lines with bone-jarring force. Spears met flesh, shields splintered, sand erupted. Senesret drove his chariot directly into the fray, scythe blades on its wheels tearing through enemy ranks. His horses shrieked as arrows clattered off their armor. The king swung his hopesh, the crescent blade carving brilliant arcs of sunlit bronze. A Nubian champion sprang toward him, muscles like coiled rope, obsidian blade raised. Senesret parried, sparks snapping, their weapons locking as they stared into each other's fury. The champion hissed, "You cannot cage us, Egyptian." Senesret's blade slid free and found its mark. The warrior crumpled, and the king drove onward. The battlefield churned into chaos, but chaos favored Egypt now. From the northern canyon mouth, fresh troops arrived not by grueling march, but ferried rapidly through canals whose waters were manipulated by sluice gates the engineers had mastered only days earlier. Nubian eyes widened as reinforcements flooded the gorge far sooner than they had expected. Then the mirrors flashed again. A second Egyptian force advanced from the south, emerging from a fort that had been completed earlier than any scout believed possible. The Nubian ranks wavered. For the first time in generations, they saw an Egyptian army that moved with impossible speed, reinforcing itself in minutes, not days. Senesret pressed the advantage. His voice thundered across the valley. "Drive them back! Force them into the river!" The clash surged toward the water. Nubian fighters resisted fiercely, some choosing to leap into the currents rather than yield. Others fought to the last breath. And then, as the sun dipped and blood stained the sand dark as obsidian, the Nubian line shattered. Survivors fled into the cliffs. Senesret did not pursue, not yet. Victory was his, but the war was not. Instead, he turned toward the dam, its unfinished face looming like a challenge. The engineers approached, dust-covered and wide-eyed. "Majesty," Anku said, voice trembling with both exhaustion and anticipation. "The final keystone can be set by nightfall. The dam will hold." Senesret nodded. "Then complete it. Tonight, the Nile becomes a weapon." As torches ignited along the scaffolding and workers labored through the dusk, Senesret walked the dam's length, listening to the river thunder beneath him. This structure, this unprecedented feat, would allow him to command the flow of life itself, control the river, control the land, control the land, control the people. He felt as if the Nile's pulse synced with his own heartbeat. Near midnight, the final block slid into place. A low tremor rippled through the stone as the dam awakened, redirecting the Nile's fury into obedient channels. The workers stepped back, awestruck. Senesret placed his hand on the warm stone. "Tomorrow," he said, "the Nubians will learn that the river now serves Egypt." At dawn, scouts reported a massing of enemy forces downstream, thousands gathering. The largest coalition of Nubian clans in decades. They intended to strike the dam, to break Egypt's spine in one blow. Senesret almost smiled. They were doing exactly what he hoped. And they did not know the trap into which they marched. He ordered his generals to prepare. Troops moved through canals in perfect synchronization, fort garrisons reinforcing one another with uncanny speed. In the distance, signal towers flashed like stars communicating across the desert. The living border was fully awake now. When the Nubian host emerged from the southern dunes, they were met not with scattered forts or weary garrisons, but with an empire that moved like a single vast creature. And the creature was hungry. Senesret raised his arm. "Open the floodgates!" the Nile roared. A wall of water surged forth, controlled, channeled, directed, turning the battlefield into a shifting maze of torrents and dry pockets where Egyptian soldiers lay in wait. The Nubians reeled as the river that had sustained them for generations became their enemy, and in the chaos, Senusret led the charge. The final conquest of Nubia had begun. Senesret III plunged into the chaos of the engineered flood with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment 100 times within the war room of his mind. The Nile's redirected waters surged around him in violent currents. Yet every eddy, every whirlpool, every channel had been calculated by his engineers. What looked like nature's fury was in fact Egypt's design. Nubian warriors struggled as the ground beneath them dissolved into knee-deep torrents or sudden pits of mud. Their formations broke apart, swallowed by the very river they had trusted since the first stories of their ancestors. But Senesret's troops moved as if born to this shifting battlefield. Units stationed on elevated berms, constructed secretly over weeks, unleashed volleys of arrows into confused enemy ranks. Chariot divisions sliced through dry corridors carved by sluice gates, appearing where no army should logically be able to maneuver. Every Nubian counterstrike smashed against an invisible wall of planning, precision, and relentless adaptation. Senesret saw panic ripple through their host, and he pressed harder, signaling with a lift of his khopesh. A mirrored flash from the fort atop the ridge responded instantly. Moments later, from the east, a regiment emerged, forces that had traveled through a canal hidden between two cliffs, a waterway Nubian scouts never detected because its entrance lay beneath an overhang of stone. The enemy shouted in disbelief. Egypt's army was everywhere at once, multiplying like phantoms. Senesret's war machine had achieved what few in history ever had: simultaneous presence across a dynamic battlefield, a real-time response system built not with clocks and ciphers, but with sunlight, water, stone, and human will. A Nubian chieftain charged toward Senesret, across the slippery ground, balancing with the grace of a desert cat, despite the rushing water. His chest was marked with swirling ochre patterns invoking river spirits for protection. He leaped onto the back of the king's chariot, tackling him with surprising strength. The two crashed into the waves as horses reared, screaming. Senesret rolled, blade flashing, struggling to find footing on the unstable terrain. The chieftain swung a curved iron dagger, grazing the king's cheek. Blood streaked down, warm against the cold spray of the Nile. "You control nothing," the chieftain growled over the roar. "Not the river, not us. When this land bleeds, it will drown you too." Senesret blocked the next strike, gritting his teeth as water surged against his legs. "This land has bled for centuries because of chaos," he snarled. "I bring order. Your order is death. Then let death itself bow." He surged forward, catching the chieftain off balance as the ground shifted under the rising flow. With a brutal twist, Senesret drove the hilt of his khopesh into the warrior's jaw, then struck again, ending the fight as the current swept the body away. The battle raged for hours. Nubian champions launched desperate offensives. Archers fired from the cliffs. Fighters swarmed the dam itself, hoping to shatter the structure and free the Nile in a catastrophic burst. But Egypt had prepared for this. Defenders atop the dam hurled heavy stones and burning pitch down upon climbers. Engineers sealed auxiliary channels, redirecting water to deny footing to the attackers. The fortress chain communicated constantly through mirrored flashes, troop movements, enemy clusters, shifts in the flood pattern. It was not simply a battle. It was a living strategy, unfolding second by second, every element reacting, adjusting, compensating. Then, as the sun climbed and the Nubian forces began to fracture under relentless pressure, Senusret noticed something unsettling. A massive contingent of enemy warriors had retreated not in surrender, but with purpose, disappearing behind the southern ridge. Not fleeing, repositioning. "What are they doing?" he muttered as he watched from the chariot platform, water still swirling around the wheels. The answer came moments later, when a plume of smoke rose from behind the ridge. then another, then 5 more. Torches lit, drums thundered, and the desert wind shifted, carrying a low, vibrating hum like a hive awakening. It was not a retreat, it was a summoning. The clans were calling reinforcements. All of them. Perhaps every tribe left in Nubia. "By the gods," one general whispered beside him, "they intend to break us with sheer numbers." "No," Senesret said. "They intend to break the dam." Across the ridge, the horizon darkened with a dust cloud. Thousands more warriors, far more than scouts had estimated, were charging toward the riverbank. Not at the Egyptians, but toward the foundations of the dam downstream where the structure tapered into softer limestone. If they undermined it with fire, picks, or brute force, the whole masterpiece could collapse in one apocalyptic burst, wiping out Egyptians and Nubians alike. The generals panicked, but Senesret felt something else: exhilaration. Because now, finally, he could reveal the last secret. Turning to Anku, who stood trembling with exhaustion and fear, Senesret said, "Open the auxiliary western canal." Anku blinked. "Majesty, that canal isn't finished." "It is finished enough." Anku ran to the signal operator and shouted the command. The mirrors flashed. Minutes later, a thunderous groan shook the battlefield as huge stone gates, until now, hidden beneath what looked like solid rock, swung open. The Nile split. A colossal portion of the river veered westward into a channel that had been dug in near secrecy, disguised by scaffolding and dust screens. The redirected torrent surged into the desert valley behind the ridge, directly into the path of the oncoming Nubian reinforcements. Senesret watched from the dam as the water hit the charging warriors like the fist of a god. Not a killing wave he had calculated that carefully, but a disorienting, mobility-shattering deluge that turned their advance into chaos. Thousands stumbled, fell, scrambled, formations dissolving instantly. Before they could recover, Egyptian chariots burst from behind concealed sandberms, having traveled through the same auxiliary canal moments earlier. They slammed into the disorganized masses with devastating force. The Nubian reinforcements crumbled. Their coordinated strike became a desperate retreat, and with their last hope shattered, the entire coalition began to fall apart. Senesret raised his khopesh high. "Encircle them." Egyptian troops closed in from all directions. Nubians fought with the fury of a cornered lion, but the network of forts, the engineered rivers, the impossible speed of Egyptian reinforcements, it was too much. By sunset, the battlefield fell silent, except for the groaning of wounded men and the churn of the redirected Nile returning to its new, controlled channels. Senesret surveyed the devastation. The sands were stained dark, the air thick with smoke. The dam stood unbroken, towering over a conquered land. Anku approached slowly. "Majesty, it is over." Senesret shook his head. "No, now we build something greater." "Greater than this?" the architect whispered. "Greater than war," Senesret said. "An Egypt that will outlast its kings." He descended the dam steps to stand on Nubian soil, soil now bound to Egypt, not by chains, but by rivers, roads, walls, canals, and the logic of an empire woven into the land itself. But as the sun dipped, painting the water blood red, a shadow passed over the king's face. For he knew that victory in Nubia was not the end. It was the beginning of something far more complex. Conquest was simple, control was harder, and maintaining an empire built on the mastery of nature itself would demand constant vigilance. Yet Senesret III, son of the sun, had never feared the weight of destiny. He welcomed it. Senesret III felt the shifting weight of the moment as he stood overlooking the subdued valley. The Nile murmured below, obedient now, reshaped by human will, yet its voice still carried hints of ancient power, as if reminding the king that no mortal could command it forever. Nevertheless, The victory was decisive. The Nubian coalition had fractured, their greatest warriors felled or scattered, their confidence broken like pottery struck upon stone. But Senesret understood better than anyone that shattered enemies could either become loyal subjects or seeds of future rebellion. The choice depended on what Egypt did next. As the wounded were carried away and the last echoes of battle faded into the dusk, Senesret mounted his chariot and ordered his men to move deeper into Nubia. Not as conquerors hungry for plunder, but as architects of permanence. Behind him, squads of scribes and surveyors followed, dragging reed baskets filled with maps, ropes, and ink. Their purpose was not war, but measurement. They would record every bend in the river, every patch of fertile soil, every village where people might one day swear loyalty to Egypt rather than cling to the memory of resistance. In the following weeks, the king traveled from settlement to settlement, his army camped in disciplined ranks behind him, his engineers spreading into the countryside with tools and tablets. Instead of razing conquered villages, Senesret offered their leaders terms: safety, trade, irrigation, and access to the canal networks in exchange for cooperation. Some refused, retreating into the hills where Egyptian control waned. But many accepted, recognizing that Egypt brought not only war but prosperity. One such leader, a matriarch named Maraka, approached Senesret with cautious dignity. Her people lived beside a narrow, fertile basin where the redirected Nile created rich new fields. "You claim our land," she said, "yet you bring water where there was none. You build roads where there were only animal trails. You offer grain for our starving children. Are you conqueror or creator, king of Kemet?" Senesret met her gaze. To build, one must first secure. Order must come before prosperity. Maraka studied him for a long moment. "Then perhaps your order will allow our children to eat." She knelt, offering a carved ivory token. Senesret accepted it silently. It marked the first voluntary submission of a Nubian clan without battle, a shift more meaningful than any clash on the sands. But peace was never simple. Far to the south, beyond the Fifth Cataract, remnants of defiant tribes regrouped, sharing tales of Egyptian manipulation of the sacred river. They called the dam an affront to the gods, a blasphemy that would one day break and drown Egypt in its hubris. Rumors of a shaman warrior named Dareth spread in exile who claimed to speak for the spirits angered by the reshaping of the Nile. At night, his followers lit fires on distant cliffs, sending signals that glowed like watchful eyes. "We have broken their armies," General Nebamon said one evening, as he stood beside Senesret at the fort of Uronarti, watching the southern horizon flicker with those fires. "But their spirits remain unbroken." "A spirit cannot be broken by steel alone," Senesret replied. "It must be reshaped." He turned to Anku. "We will build temples along the frontier. Shrines honoring both Egyptian gods and those Nubians hold sacred. Show them that the river does not divide us, it sustains us both." Anku bowed. "As you command." So construction began anew, not for war, but for diplomacy. Temples rose beside forts, adorned with carvings that blended Egyptian lotus motifs with Nubian cattle horn symbols. Priests of both cultures performed shared rituals to bless the new waters and sanctify the canals. A delicate, fragile peace began to settle. Yet Dareth did not vanish. Instead, he grew into a phantom presence, never seen except by frightened shepherds, never captured though Egyptian patrols scoured the ravines. His influence seeped like shadow into the hearts of those who feared Egypt's reshaping of the land. Then one night, months after the final battle, a tremor shook the dam. Workers heard a rumble deep beneath the foundations. Alarms spread through the forts as soldiers lit torches and rushed to inspect the stone arcs. For a moment, fear gripped them, the thought that Dareth's prophecy of divine vengeance had come true. But Anku, after racing across the dam with his team, shook his head. "It is not a failure," he said breathlessly to Senesret. "It is sabotage." The king's expression, hardened. Marks were found on the lower retaining walls, chisel scars made deliberately, carefully, by someone with knowledge of architecture. And scattered in the mud nearby lay a bundle of ochre-stained feathers, the signature worn by Dareth's followers. The sabotage had not been enough to bring the dam down, but it was enough to send a message. "He wishes to frighten the people," Nabamon said, "to remind them that the river belongs to their gods, not to Egypt." Senesret surveyed the dark waters below. "Then we will remind them that gods favor strength, not fear." A hunt for Dareth began, one not marked by open battle, but by silent pursuit through winding gorges and moonlit dunes. Scouts traced his movements through abandoned shrines and hidden caves, collecting tokens he left behind as if taunting the Egyptians. Days stretched into weeks, and then, during a sandstorm that swallowed the moon and filled the air with howling winds, Dareth attacked. He struck the outlying canal stations first, overwhelming guards with uncanny ferocity. Then he moved toward the village of Maraka, intent on destroying the newly built temple that symbolized the fragile unity between Nubians and Egyptians. When the flames rose against the storm-dark sky, Senesret was already racing toward the village with elite guards. The storm battered them like a living beast, wind clawing at their cloaks, sand stinging their flesh. But the king drove forward, refusing to yield ground. By the time they arrived, the temple was ablaze. Villagers fled in panic as Dareth stood at its entrance, arms raised, chanting words drowned by the storm, but filled with unmistakable hatred. Senesret leaped from his horse and charged toward the shaman warrior. Their clash was swallowed by wind and fire, sparks flying as their blades met. Dareth moved with unnatural precision, as if every gust of wind obeyed him. But Senesret was unyielding, his will forged in war and stone. At last, with a decisive strike, he disarmed Dareth, sending his blade spinning into the sand. The shaman staggered back, gasping, "You twist the river, you twist fate, but fate will recoil." Senesret raised his hopesh. Fate favors those who build. The final blow fell, and Dareth collapsed, lifeless, into the burning sand. When the storm cleared hours later, the temple was saved, the fires extinguished, and the people gathered around their king as dawn broke over the dunes. With Dareth's death, the last force of organized resistance crumbled. Nubia, though still proud and fiercely independent in spirit, accepted that Egypt's presence would endure. And in the years that followed, Senesret's vision transformed the entire region. Forts became trade hubs, canals nurtured new farms, the dam ensured stable floods, ending cycles of famine. The border, once a battleground, became a corridor of prosperity. Yet Senesret never forgot the war, nor the shadows that had opposed him, for he understood that power was not a triumph, it was a burden, one he would bear until his final breath. Senesret III stood atop the highest tower of the Semna fortress, gazing southward into the horizon where the desert met the sky in an unbroken sweep of gold. Years had passed since the great battles, since Dareth's final stand beneath the storm and flame, yet the memory of conflict lingered like an echo in the stones beneath his feet. The border was no longer the wild, fractured frontier it had once been. It now pulsed with order boats gliding through regulated canals, merchant caravans moving safely between fortified outposts, and farmers in both Egypt and Nubia using redirected waters to cultivate fields that had once withered in the heat. But Senesret knew that peace was never permanent. It was a structure built like the dam, enduring yet always vulnerable. One sabotage, one tremor, one lapse of vigilance from collapse. And so he watched, always watched, as the sunrise crawled across the desert and lit the distant ridges in a copper glow. Below, the Semna garrison was beginning its morning drills, shields clashing, spears snapping into formation. Beyond them, Nubian children ran along the canal banks, laughing as they splashed water onto each other, their mothers calling them back toward their homes now built partly with Egyptian stone, Partly with Nubian timber, a silent architecture of cooperation, the king allowed himself a small exhale. There was something beautiful in seeing enemies become neighbors, fear dissolving into routine, and routine into trust. But trust, he reminded himself, was a fragile luxury. He descended the tower and strode through the bustling compound, passing scribes, tallying grain stores, and engineers discussing improvements to the canal locks. When he entered the command hall, Anku stood beside a large clay model spread across the table, a detailed map of the entire Egyptian-Nubian border system. Rivers, canals, forts, supply depots, shrines, and villages sprawled across the miniature landscape, like veins across a living body. "Majesty," Anku said as he bowed. "We've completed the latest stability inspections. The dam remains secure, but the western auxiliary canal shows increased erosion. We may need to reinforce the embankment with additional blocks." Senesret nodded. "Do it, and double the garrison there. Even in peace, we cannot let our vigilance falter." As Anku marked his tablets, General Nebamon entered with a furrowed brow. "Majesty, a matter requiring your attention. A messenger from Kerma arrives with urgent news." Senesret stiffened slightly. Kerma, one of the great Nubian cities far to the south, had entered a tentative alliance with Egypt in recent years, bound by mutual trade and the promise of infrastructure improvements. For a messenger to arrive unannounced meant something significant. "Bring him," the king said. The messenger entered dust-covered, weary, and clearly terrified of speaking before the ruler of the two lands. He bowed deeply. "Great king," he said breathlessly. "Kerma faces division. Some elders reject cooperation with Egypt. Others embrace it. Tensions rise. And now, strange omens plague the river." Senesret's eyes narrowed. "Omens?" "The waters near Kerma churn as if boiling. Fish die. The river spirits, the priests say, are in turmoil." Nebamon scoffed. Superstition. But Senesret did not scoff. He remembered Dareth's words, the trembling stones, the feeling that shaping the Nile had awakened forces not yet fully understood. "What else?" he asked. The messenger swallowed hard. "A group of warriors, calling themselves the Children of the Deep, has risen. They claim to finish what Dareth began." A ripple of tension crossed the room. Nebamon clenched his jaw. "Dareth's ghost reaches long," Anku murmured. "But why now? After years of peace?" Senesret turned toward the map. "Because peace has grown too comfortable, and comfort breeds resentment among those who thrive on chaos." He tapped the region near Kerma on the clay model. "We ride south." Within hours, a column of Egyptian soldiers moved through the desert, accompanied by engineers, priests, and scribes. The march took several days, the heat unrelenting, but the canals and forts they had constructed during the early conquests made their passage faster than any army before them. They stopped briefly at each outpost to gather reports. All confirmed the same unsettling truth. The river had begun to behave strangely. Currents shifted in unpredictable ways. Water levels fluctuated without explanation. And in some places, the river seemed angry. When they finally approached Kerma, smoke curled above the skyline. The city gates were open, but unguarded. Senesret entered cautiously, his soldiers fanning out to secure the streets. Inside, the scene was chaos. Shrines had been defaced, statues toppled, markets abandoned. And on the steps of the great meeting hall, a group of priests knelt, trembling. "What happened?" Senesret demanded. An elder priest rose, leaning heavily on his staff. "Great king, the children of the deep struck 2 nights ago. They claimed the river's wrath would fall upon us for welcoming Egyptian influence. They destroyed our water measuring stations, burned our storehouses, and fled toward the gorge." "The gorge?" Anku muttered. "That leads directly to the southernmost tributary. If they sabotage it, they could destabilize the entire Nile system." Senusret finished coldly. And with it, the peace we've built. Nebamon pointed toward the distant cliffs where the gorge carved a dark scar into the landscape. Majesty, we should pursue immediately. Senesret mounted his chariot. We will, but with caution. The river is unsettled, and unsettled water hides danger. They rode into the gorge, the walls rising steep and jagged on either side. The sound of rushing water filled the narrow corridor. Far ahead, torches flickered. Figures moved with frantic speed, dragging bundles of timber and jars of oil. The children of the deep were preparing to ignite the riverbank supports an act that would collapse the tributary channel, sending massive surges upstream and destabilizing the dam far to the north. Senesret raised his hand. His soldiers halted. He studied the scene. The gorge was too tight for a direct assault. Any sudden movement could cause a landslide or ignite the oil prematurely. Anku whispered urgently, Majesty, if they ignite those jars, they won't. Senesret said, Not if the river helps us. He scanned the gorge and noticed a natural overhang above the enemy, a fault line where water had slowly eroded the rock. One well-placed strike could send a cascade of stone and water down upon the saboteurs, non-lethal but disabling. He signaled a small team of archers. Aim for the crack in the cliff, not the enemy, the stone. The archers nodded, knocked their arrows, and let them fly. The first arrow struck the crack with a sharp clang. The second wedged deeper. The third shattered a protruding stone. A rumble thundered through the gorge. The saboteurs looked up in terror as the cliffside cracked open, sending a torrent of rocks and redirected water crashing down like a controlled avalanche. Oil jars smashed harmlessly, their contents washed away before they could ignite. The children of the deep scattered, slipping and screaming as water swept them from their positions. Egyptian troops surged forward, capturing them swiftly. When the chaos settled, Senesret approached the captured leader, a scarred man whose eyes held wild conviction. Why? Senesret demanded. Why destroy what feeds your people? The man spat. You have chained the river. It will turn on you. We sought to free it. Senesret leaned close. The river is not a beast to be freed or chained. It is life, and life must be guided. The man laughed bitterly. You think you guide it, but you only delay its vengeance. The king stood, cold determination hardening in his gaze. Then we will build stronger. Over the next days, Egypt restored Kerma's structures, redesigned the tributary supports, and reinforced the gorge. Priests from both cultures held ceremonies to calm the river and reassure the people. Slowly, the turmoil subsided, the water steadied, trade resumed. And the children of the deep, leaderless and defeated, vanished into obscurity. As Senesret prepared to depart Kerma, Maraka arrived unexpectedly, having traveled far to speak with him. Great king, she said solemnly, you have quelled the unrest. But beware, when you change the river, you change the people. Some will adapt, others will break. Senusret nodded. Then we will continue shaping both, with strength, with wisdom, with patience. She bowed. Then perhaps Egypt and Nubia will endure together. He returned to the Semna fortress, with much to consider. The border fort stood proud, the canals sparkled with life, the dam hummed with stability. Yet beneath it all, the river whispered its ancient secrets, reminding him that nothing humans built, however mighty, could stand without constant vigilance. And Senusret III, who had conquered Nubia not only with armies, but with infrastructure, strategy, and unyielding will, vowed that as long as he ruled, Egypt's frontier would never again be defined by weakness. It would be defined by vision. He looked upon the desert, the river, the forts stretching like a spine of power across the land. His legacy, his burden, his triumph. Senesret III felt the settling calm of the frontier, like the inhale before a great exhale, a fragile quiet that carried both promise and danger as he rode southward along the newly fortified corridor. The sun hammered the desert in molten sheets, and yet the river beside him flowed with a steady grace, born of engineering rather than chance. The dam held, the canals diverted, the forts stood. And now, with Dareth gone, and the flames of rebellion smothered beneath stone, steel, and diplomacy, the king turned his mind toward permanence. But permanence was a larger battlefield than any clash of warriors. It required not only defending land, but shaping it, bending its future toward a purpose no enemy could reverse. He paused near the fortified island of Mergissa, where masons chiseled cartouches into fresh limestone blocks. The clang of bronze echoed across the riverbank as if declaring that Egypt would no longer merely pass through Nubia, it would stay. Yet even here, where discipline reigned and construction thrived, shadows lingered. Word arrived that scattered bands of Dareth's followers, now leaderless but desperate, were sabotaging irrigation dikes, stealing tools, and ambushing lone workers. Not organized enough for a rebellion, but disruptive enough to threaten progress. Senesret summoned Commander Kassa, a Nubian-born officer who had risen through Egyptian ranks after proving his loyalty. Kassa approached with a warrior's posture and a watchful gaze that spoke of still-burning tensions between his blood and his allegiance. "The stragglers retreat south," Kassa reported. "They strike at night, melt into ravines, and prey on fear. The people whisper that Dareth's spirit guides them still." "Spirits are easily dismissed," Senesret said, "once their followers have no sanctuaries left." Kassa hesitated. "Then you should know, their new refuge may lie beyond our mapped territory. Caves etched with symbols older than either of our kingdoms, places the locals refuse to approach." Senesret's eyes narrowed. "Then we will map them." Over the next days, the king led a column deep into territories untouched by Egypt's quills or chisels. They traversed gorges where the wind moaned like trapped ghosts, crossed dunes, rippled into frozen waves, and followed trails barely marked, except by broken pottery or bones half buried in sand. The land itself felt older here, raw and unshaped, as though resisting the idea of being claimed. One night, as the army camped beneath cliffs streaked with mineral veins glowing faintly in the moonlight, Kassa approached Senesret with a stone tablet found near an abandoned fire pit. Upon it, crude carvings depicted the dam breaking apart, water exploding outward in a chaotic flood, drowning fort walls and cities alike. "Propaganda," Nebamon scoffed when Kassa presented it. "Dareth's final warning to his people." But Senesret's gaze lingered on the image. "Fear," he said slowly, "is the last weapon of the defeated, and sometimes the most dangerous." They pressed onward, and soon the cliffs gave way to a hidden valley carved by ancient floods. Strange spiraling patterns were etched into the rock walls, far older than Nubian cattle symbols or Egyptian lotus motifs. Priests accompanying the army murmured prayers, uneasy. "These markings," Anku said, brushing sand from one engraving, "suggest a cult predating even the earliest dynasties, something tied to the river's earliest worship." Senesret studied the spirals, sensing the weight of forgotten history pressing close. Then Dareth was not drawing his strength from rebellion, he said. He was drawing it from memory. As they explored the valley, scouts reported a cavern complex ahead where the stragglers had taken refuge. Torches flickered within the dark mouths of the caves, and echoes of chanting drifted out, low and resonant. When Senesret approached with his elite guard, silhouettes appeared, emaciated figures draped in feathers and ochre, eyes shining with fanatic fervor. "Dareth is dead," Kassa called out, stepping forward. "Your cause ended with him. Lay down your weapons and be granted mercy." A ragged voice answered from the darkness. "Dareth lives in the river's pulse. You have silenced the man, but not the prophecy." Figures surged forward, brandishing jagged blades and fire-hardened spears. Senesret's guards met them with shields raised, kopjes curving through the air in swift arcs. The clash was fierce but brief. The stragglers were fueled by desperation, not skill. When the battle ended, only a few survivors remained, trembling and defeated. Senesret ordered them captured rather than killed. They might still be useful as guides or warnings. The cavern's depths beckoned, and Senesret entered with Anku and Kasa at his side. Inside, the walls pulsated with ancient red pigment, swirling like whirlpools frozen in stone. At the far end lay an underground pool fed by a trickling spring that glimmered in their torchlight. Floating upon its surface were wooden idols carved into serpent-like forms. "A cult of the deep river," Anku whispered. "Long before Egypt or Nubia claimed these lands." Senesret approached the pool. "Dareth believed the river itself opposed our work, but the river does not choose. It only flows." He turned sharply. "We have mapped the land above. Now we will map what lies beneath." Anku blinked. "My king, what would that achieve?" "Knowledge is the foundation of control," Senesret said. "If the people fear ancient forces, we will understand those forces better than they do." Over the next weeks, Anku led expeditions into subterranean tunnels where water had carved passages through limestone over millennia. They charted underground currents, discovered natural reservoirs, and studied mineral deposits that revealed how the river migrated across ages. What they found astonished them. Evidence that earlier civilizations long vanished had attempted to channel the waters with crude walls and embankments. Senesret took this as validation of Egypt's work. "We do not defy the river," he said. "We continue the labor of forgotten ancestors." But not everyone welcomed the revelation. Some Nubian elders felt their myths unraveling, their spiritual anchors shaken by evidence that contradicted their beliefs. Tensions simmered, subtle but growing. Maraka, now an important liaison between Egypt and the southern clans, warned Senesret one evening as she arrived at Mergissa. "Truth can be as dangerous as lies," she said softly. "When people feel their past slipping away, they cling harder to whatever remains." Senesret regarded her thoughtfully. "Then we will give them a new truth, one strong enough to hold. If it comes from you," she said, "it must be spoken with respect, not domination." Her words lingered with him. That same night, a messenger arrived from the northern forts bearing urgent news. A flash flood had surged near Semna, overwhelming an unfinished canal and sweeping away dozens of workers. Panic rippled through local villages, who took the disaster as a sign the river hungered for retribution. Senesret departed at dawn. When he arrived at the flood site, the devastation stunned even him. The canal walls had collapsed inward, leaving mud-churned chaos littered with broken beams and shattered tools. Survivors lay huddled beneath makeshift shelters, haunted by what they had seen. "The dam held," Anku said, inspecting the damage. "This was a natural surge, not sabotage." "Natural or not," Nebaman muttered, "the people will see it as divine punishment." Senesret knelt beside a collapsed embankment, scooping a handful of mud. It slipped through his fingers in sluggish rivulets. "Then we will turn their fear into faith." Over the following days, he walked among the wounded, speaking directly to them, promising that Egypt would rebuild stronger, safer, wiser. He ordered emergency granaries opened, distributing grain without tax. He oversaw funeral rites blending Egyptian and Nubian traditions, ensuring every family felt honored. Slowly, fear ebbed. Loyalty replaced despair. And as the people watched the king labor alongside workers to repair the canal, their trust deepened. That night, as fires glowed across the camp and the repaired canal began redirecting water back into the fields, Anku approached Senesret. "Your presence has soothed their fears," the engineer said. "But fear may return with the next flood, or the next rumor." Senesret looked toward the fort walls rising in the darkness. Then we will build not just walls and canals, he said. We will build belief. He rose, his silhouette framed against the torchlit ramparts. A kingdom endures when its people know the land, and its masters protect them. Our forts will stand not as symbols of conquest, but guardianship. Our canals will not merely feed crops, they will feed trust. As the night deepened, the king sensed a shift in the frontier. The war was over. The rebellion was crushed. The river had been tamed. But the true conquest, the conquest of hearts, minds, and memory, was only beginning. Senesret III rose before dawn each morning, long before the garrison stirred, long before the river caught the first traces of gold from the climbing sun. The frontier had become his workshop, his proving ground, his monument. But something deeper stirred beneath its surface, something he sensed but could not yet name. Even victory left aftershocks. Even control cast shadows. One of those shadows emerged in the form of caravans, arriving from deeper south, small groups of traders bearing incense, hides, and beads who claimed to come in peace, yet watched the forts with an unease that did not match their smiles. Their leader, a tall man named Ertika, bowed deeply before Senesret when first granted audience, but his eyes flicked constantly toward the horizon where the dunes shimmered in hazy layers of heat. We bring gifts, Ertaka said, presenting ivory figurines carved with fluid artistry. We bring greetings, but we also bring warnings. Nebamon stiffened at the implication, but Senesret remained still, expression unreadable. Speak your warning. The land changes, Ertaka murmured. The river changes. The spirits stir. Too many walls rise where wind once roamed freely. Too many channels cut through ancient ground. You may think you command the river, but you awaken things buried. The figurines Ertaka offered depicted coiling shapes, half serpent, half human, emerging from waves. Anku examined them later in the king's tent. My king, these are from the cult we discovered in the cavern. These traders may be remnants of that same tradition, or simply believers frightened by what we build. Senesret traced a finger over the ivory serpent's curves. If they carry superstition to their people, fear will spread again, and fear births rebellion. Nebamon proposed arrests, but Senesret shook his head. No. We will not create martyrs. Instead, we will create witnesses. Let them see what Egypt brings. So he invited Ertaka and his caravan to travel with the Egyptian engineers for several days, watching as canals revived fields long abandoned, as sick villagers received poultices from Egyptian healers, as workers sang while hauling limestone blocks for new temples that blended Egyptian clarity with Nubian warmth. Ertaka's stern expression softened, but only slightly. You build strong things, he conceded, but strength draws the attention of enemies. Senesret watched him carefully. What enemies? The trader hesitated. Not my place to speak. But the unease in his voice seeded caution in the king's mind. When the caravan departed, escorted safely past the southern outposts, Senesret issued new orders. Scouts were to push deeper into uncharted valleys. Supply chains were to be doubled. And Kasa was to monitor rumor and hearsay with a sharper ear than ever before. Weeks passed. The forts thrummed with activity. Semna's granaries rose in precise rectangular rows. Kuma bustled with farmers trading grain for bronze tools. Children ran through the dusty streets wearing charms, blending ankhs with cattle horns, a symbol of the emerging hybrid culture Senesret had hoped to foster. Yet beneath this surface harmony, disquiet remained a soft, constant pressure, like the hush before a sandstorm. It intensified when a soldier from the southernmost border post arrived at Mergissa, bloodied, delirious, whispering of figures stalking the dunes at night. Not rebels, he gasped to Nebamon. Not bandits. They moved like shadows, silent, watching. Senesret stood over him. "How many?" "I saw only 3," the soldier whispered. "But their footprints, too many. Too many to count." Scouts confirmed the tracks deep, wide, numerous, but sandstorms obscured their origin. Anku believed it might be deserters gathering from many tribes. Nebamon believed it meant a coming attack. Kasa believed something older was awakening. And Senesret believed only one thing: no force would threaten the frontier he had spent years forging. He gathered his commanders around a clay map of the border forts. The flickering lamplight cast shifting shadows across the miniature canals and walls formed in careful detail. "Our enemy hides," Senesret said, "because it fears open confrontation. That means it is weak. But weakness can be dangerous when desperate. We will not wait to be struck." Nebamon predictably recommended a coordinated sweep with 4 divisions. Kasa argued for stealth and precision. Anku suggested using the canal networks to funnel any hostile forces toward predetermined areas where defenses were strongest. Senesret listened, absorbing every idea. "We will combine your strategies," he finally said. "We will move quietly, but not blindly. Swiftly, but not recklessly. And we will bring with us something no enemy expects." He turned to Anku. "Prepare the engineers." "Engineers, my king?" Anku blinked. "We go to confront an enemy, not build." "On the contrary," Senesret said, "we will build the battleground itself." Days later, an Egyptian column moved south, not with thunderous drums or chariots, but in disciplined, near-silent progression. Soldiers carried sand-colored shields and spears wrapped in linen to muffle sound. Sappers brought ropes, stakes, and collapsible frames. Engineers dragged the components of water gates and flood barriers. It was not an army marching to battle. It was an army marching to reshape battle. Their destination lay beyond the last mapped gorge, where rocky outcrops rose like petrified beasts and the wind carried a low, mournful hum. Kasa, leading the scouts, signaled when he found the first unmistakable sign: a cluster of abandoned huts, half buried in sand, their doorways adorned with fresh spirals traced in white ash. "They were here," he murmured, "not long ago." That night, the Egyptian camp settled in absolute darkness. Fires unlit, soldiers whispering as if the air itself might eavesdrop. The river murmured somewhere distant, and the ground thrummed faintly beneath the sand as though the earth held its breath. Near midnight, Kasa slipped into Senesret's tent. "Movement," he whispered. "Lots of it." Senesret rose instantly. They climbed a rocky ridge overlooking the valley. In the moonlight, faint silhouettes drifted across the dunes. Hundreds of figures, slow and fluid, like a migrating tide. "Who are they?" Nebamon murmured, awestruck despite himself. Kasa's voice tightened. "Not an army, a pilgrimage!" And indeed, the figures did not carry weapons. Instead, they bore idols, braziers, bundles of sticks, carved stones. They moved toward the cliffs, where a yawning fissure glowed with firelight. "A gathering of the old cult," Anku whispered, horrified. "But this many? How could they unite so quickly?" Senesret understood in a way the others did not. Dareth was only a spark. The river itself is the flame. They fear we have chained it. The pilgrims entered the fissure, chanting low and resonant. The sound reverberated off the gorge walls in strange, unsettling harmonies. "If they perform a ritual," Nebamon said tightly, "it could turn the entire frontier against us." "Then we stop the ritual," Kasa said, quietly, decisively. But Senesret lifted a hand. "No, we do not storm their sacred gathering. That would ignite rebellion faster than the ritual itself." Anku looked baffled. "Then what do we do?" Senesret smiled a thin, iron-bound smile. We do what Egypt does best. We reshape the land. Under the cover of night, Anku's engineers moved into position along the upper ridge, where a natural channel, long dry, cut toward the fissure. They worked silently, constructing a temporary gate of stones and wooden braces reinforced with ropes. At Senesret's signal, sappers broke the upstream embankment with carefully placed wedges. A surge of water, small but forceful enough, raced down the ancient channel. It reached the engineered gate, paused against its barrier, then redirected precisely as designed, flowing not into the fissure, but around it, circling the cliff base like a shining serpent before pooling harmlessly into the lower basin. The chanting inside halted abruptly. Shouts rose. Figures stumbled out of the fissure, staring at the flowing water in fear-struck awe. To them, it looked not like engineered redirection, but divine intervention, an unmistakable sign that the river rejected their ritual and blessed Egypt's authority. Kassa watched in wonder. "You gave them a miracle." "No," Senesret said softly. "I gave them understanding." The pilgrims fell to their knees. Their leaders approached the Egyptians with trembling reverence. "The river speaks," one whispered. "It chooses its master." Senesret stepped forward into the moonlight, letting its pale glow crown him like a mantle. "The river chooses no master," he said, "but it favors those who protect it." And so the last embers of resistance, spiritual, cultural, ancestral, dwindled into ash beneath the weight of awe and inevitability. The cult's leaders pledged peace. The pilgrims dispersed, carrying tales of the king who commanded water without defying it. When the Egyptians marched back north, the frontier felt different, lighter, steadier, as if a storm had broken and the air finally cleared. Yet Senesret knew the work was not finished. The fort stood. The canals thrived. The dam endured. But unity, true unity, required more than infrastructure and fear. It required a shared destiny. As he approached Semna's towering walls at sunset, watching soldiers salute and children chase one another near the docks, he whispered to himself, "Now begins the real conquest." Senesret III returned to the heart of the frontier, bearing not spoils, but silence, the kind that follows a great turning point in which no one yet understands what has changed, but everyone feels the ground shifting beneath them. Semna's walls greeted him like the teeth of a great stone beast guarding the threshold of a new world. Soldiers knelt as he passed. Farmers paused their labors. Children stared with the wide-eyed reverence reserved for someone who had stepped into myth. And yet the king felt none of the triumph they imagined. Victory was a transient jewel, the weight of shaping a land that was the true burden, and it settled heavier with each passing day. Anku hurried beside him, scrolls clutched in both hands. "My king, since your departure, settlements along the lower canals have doubled in yield, but there are issues of allocation. Some claim too much water, others too little. Disputes rise daily," Nebaman added, "and there are rumors that some elders believe the pilgrimage was thwarted by magic stolen from their gods. They do not speak openly, but they whisper." Whispers spread. Kassa stayed silent until Senesret looked at him. "My king, what we achieved was wonder, but wonders age. Awe fades. And when it does, people search for explanations, some favorable, some not." Senesret nodded slowly. "Then we will give them explanations. Through law, through labor, through wisdom." That night, he called a grand council, not of generals or priests, but of local leaders from every village and clan along the frontier. Maraka sat beside representatives of rival families, each wearing expressions of cautious curiosity. Irtaka had returned as well, compelled not by loyalty, but by the need to understand the forces shaping his homeland. Senesret addressed them not from a throne, but standing level upon the earth. "This land is no longer a border," he said. "It is a bond. Egypt does not come to claim, Egypt comes to build. But for building to endure, all voices must speak. Morocco rose first. "Then hear mine," she said. "Your canals have revived our fields. Your forts protect our trade. But your presence swells quickly, like water behind a weak dam. We fear that one day your strength will drown us." Senesret met her gaze. "Strength is not made to drown. It is made to lift. But only if shared." He ordered scribes forward with clay tablets inscribed with new doctrine, water distribution laws, guaranteeing every clan fair access, representation councils at each fort, a rotating oversight of canal maintenance involving Egyptians and Nubians alike. Murmurs rose around the firelit hall. Irtaka studied the tablets carefully. "This is unprecedented," he admitted. "No kingdom to the north has ever offered us voice in its rule." "Then, let this be the first," Senesret said. For a moment, the council seemed united. But unity is a fragile stone, easily cracked. The following day, a messenger arrived, breathless from the northern delta. "My king," the man said, bowing low, "there are concerns in Ichtawi. Nobles say you have given too much authority to foreigners. They question your judgment. Some claim your heart lies in Nubia, not Egypt." Nebamon bristled with fury. "Treasonous dogs!" But Senesret lifted a hand. "Not treason, fear." He knew well how swiftly fear could rot even the strongest foundations. "If northern faith falters, then we must reinforce it. Egypt must see what we have accomplished here." So he ordered the construction of a monumental stela, taller than any erected before, documenting not only the conquest of Nubia, but the unity forged afterward. It would stand at Semna, facing Egypt, a stone declaration that the king did not divide his loyalties, but expanded them. While masons began their work, Senesret traveled north, briefly to address the nobles directly. In the great court of Ichtawi, he spoke not of diplomacy or concessions, but of strength, strategy, and survival. "The forts protect our trade," he told them. "The canals bring wealth, the dam ensures predictable harvests, and the alliance forged in Nubia strengthens our borders. Do not mistake cooperation for weakness. It is the greatest strength of all." The nobles bowed in reluctant acceptance. Yet Senesret saw their skepticism lingering like a stain on polished stone. When he returned to the frontier, the air felt different, tenser, as if the land itself sensed discord brewing in distant halls. And then, just as the stela reached its halfway point in height, disaster struck. A tremor shook the earth beneath Semna, subtle at first, but quickly escalating. Workers stumbled as scaffolding swayed. Stones trembled loose from walls. The ground roared like a wounded beast. Anku rushed to Senesret's side. "It comes from the southern fault lines," he shouted over the rumbling. "A natural quake." But Nebamon, steadying himself against a wall, growled. "Nothing natural strikes when tensions rise. Someone has stirred dark forces." The quake lasted only moments, but its consequences spread swiftly. A canal near Semna burst its banks, flooding nearby fields. A segment of the dam's lower retaining wall cracked, small but alarming. The stela's upper half toppled, smashing into the earth with a thunderous crash. Panic erupted through the settlements. If fear had been a whisper before, now it was a shout. "The river rebels." Some cried, "The gods send warnings." Priests from distant clans flocked to the area, demanding the halting of all construction until the spirits were appeased. Anku insisted the damage could be repaired. Morocco urged calm, but hysteria spreads faster than truth. That night, flames erupted in a storehouse containing hydraulic tools. Rebels, small in number but emboldened by chaos, attacked a patrol near the western gorge. The frontier teetered on the edge of collapse. Senesret stood atop the cracked stela base at dawn, watching smoke drift across the horizon like dark omens. Kassa approached quietly. "My king." The quake was real, But something else happened during the tremors. Tracks were seen near the southern caves. Fresh tracks, too large to be human. Senesret turned sharply. "Explain." "The pilgrims spoke of guardians," Casa said. "Spirits bound to the deep river. My scouts found impressions near the cavern pools. Deep, broad, like the coils of some great creature dragged across the earth." Nebamon spat dismissively. "Myths, nothing more." But Anku looked troubled. "The underground currents, they may have shifted. Something long trapped beneath stone could have surfaced." Senesret felt a chill, not of fear, but of resolve. "Then we must see it with our own eyes." Despite objections, he led a small party south toward the cavern valley. When they arrived, the air felt unnaturally cool. The spiraled symbols etched by ancient hands seemed to shimmer in the half-light. And then they found it. A collapsed section of cavern wall, revealing a chamber previously sealed off. Inside lay a vast pool of dark water, still as obsidian. And upon its edge, half buried in silt, lay a colossal stone idol carved in the shape of a serpent, coiled protectively around a stylized river. Its eyes, gems of unknown origin, glimmered faintly. Anku knelt, breath caught. This predates every structure we know. The early Nubian tribes believed the river had guardians, manifestations of its will. Casa touched the idol's surface. Whether myth or memory, someone knew this chamber once existed. And if they knew, they might believe the quake was the guardian awakening. Nebamon grunted. "And people believe what frightens them most." Senesret stared at the idol, mind turning with the precision of a master strategist. "If the people need their guardian," he said quietly, "then we will give them one." "You mean to play into the myth?" Nebamon asked. "No," Senesret replied. "To complete it." Over the following days, he ordered engineers to study the chamber, priests to translate the symbols, artisans to sketch the idol. Slowly a vision formed in his mind, a monumental shrine at Semna, dedicated to the spirit of the river, bridging Egyptian and Nubian belief, sanctifying the dam as an instrument of divine will rather than human ambition. "We give them a guardian," he said to Maraka, "not a creature of fear, but a symbol of unity, a shared protector." She studied him, then nodded. Such a guardian could heal many fractures. Construction began swiftly. Artisans carved a grand statue based on the cavern idol, a serpentine form rising in elegant arcs, crowned with a lotus, holding a stylized river between its coils. Priests from both cultures crafted rituals to honor it, blending traditions in ways never seen before. When the statue was raised beside the dam, shimmering beneath torchlight, crowds gathered in awe. Senesret addressed them. "This guardian does not replace your gods nor ours. It stands for the river itself, source of life for all people. Together, we honor it. Together, we protect it. Together, we prosper." Cheers erupted, not universal, but strong enough to shift the balance. Fear receded. Unity blossomed again. And just as the fortresses returned to peace, rumors spread north of a new threat rising beyond the Fifth Cataract. Not rebels, not pilgrims. Something far more dangerous. Raiders organized, armed with unfamiliar weapons, moving with unnatural speed, had begun attacking distant outposts not aligned with Egypt. Survivors described them as wearing masks carved with swirling patterns, carrying staffs tipped with carved bone and obsidian. "A new cult?" Nebamon asked. "Or something worse?" Casa murmured. Senesret looked toward the distant south, where the river wound like a dark ribbon into lands unmapped. "Whatever they are," he said, "they threaten the balance we forged. And so, despite fatigue, despite political strain, despite the tremors of earth and spirit, the king prepared to march again, not to conquer, but to confront the unknown, rising from the deep reaches beyond the familiar world." Senesret felt the desert tighten around him as if the very air were drawing breath for what was about to unfold. The Nubian host stretching across the southern horizon moved like a storm front. Tens of thousands massed in loose, fluid formations, dust rising around them in a shimmering veil that turned the dawn light red as spilled blood. Yet the king did not flinch. For everything he had built, the forts, the canals, the dam, the floodgates, the network of mirrors and runners, and coded drum signals had been constructed precisely for this moment. The moment when Nubia would gather its full strength and hurl it at him with the fury of a people who refused to bow. And as he watched their approach, he felt the exhilaration of a commander whose battlefield had been carved by his own vision. He signaled his engineers, who waited by the lever mechanisms carved into the dam's outer shell, and they prepared themselves, muscles tense, breaths held, while the thunder of the approaching enemy grew louder. The Nubians advanced in great crescent formations, their longbows raised, their shields of hardened hide gleaming with oil and river clay, and their war drums boomed deep enough to rattle the stones beneath Senesret's chariot. Yet the king only raised his arm in a slow, deliberate motion, a gesture that sent a ripple of anticipation through his soldiers. Egyptian archers readied their bows, charioteers tightened their reins, infantry braced their shields, but they did not advance. They did not charge. They merely waited. For the king had told them that this day would not be won by rushing forward, but by drawing the enemy into the web he had spun across the frontier. The Nubian vanguard broke into a run, their warriors unleashing volleys of arrows that screeched through the sky, clattering against Egyptian shields. A few horses reared. A few men fell. But the ranks remained firm, unshaken, because they knew the king's timing would be perfect. And when the Nubian lines reached the center of the valley, when thousands pressed into the narrowing lowland Senesret had chosen, he drew a breath and gave the command. Release the river. At once the engineers slammed the levers forward. The floodgates trembled, then roared open, and the Nile surged out in a titanic torrent that carved through the floodplains like a charging bull god, hurling walls of churning, white-tipped water directly into the Nubian flank. Warriors screamed as the current ripped them from their feet, shields torn from their hands, formations fractured. The sudden flood did not drown them wholesale. That was not the intent, but it scattered their forces, snapped the spine of their advance, forced them into chaotic clusters that struggled to maintain cohesion. The ground transformed under them, mud sucking at their ankles, swirling eddies toppling them, and above it all, Egyptian horns sounded, their notes long and triumphant. Senesret spurred his chariot forward in that instant, slicing through the gap that the flood had carved, his guard racing behind him in wedge formation, their blades gleaming with reflected sunlight. The Nubians scrambled to regroup, but the king's elite troops crashed into them like a living spear, and suddenly the valley erupted with the screams of battle. The king swung his khopesh in a great arc, its bronze edge singing as it cleaved through a Nubian shield. Then bone, then muscle. He drove onward, his horses thundering, his wheels slicing through the flooded ground with practiced precision, while around him, Egyptian infantry surged into the enemy's fragmented ranks, pushing them deeper into the watery trap. But the Nubians were not defeated, not yet, for their rear lines adjusted swiftly, and out of the swirling mist of river spray came a countercharge of colossal warriors, each bearing massive two-handed axes carved of obsidian so black it devoured the sunlight. These were the champions of the southern tribes, men raised from childhood for the sole purpose of breaking armies, and they roared their defiance as they barreled toward Senesret's formation. The king saw them coming and signaled a rapid shift. Chariots veered apart, infantry braced, and archers repositioned on higher ground carved into the valley's rocky shoulders. The champions leapt into the chaos, swinging their axes with terrifying force, cleaving shields and splitting spears, each blow buckling the men who tried to withstand it. Senesret pivoted his chariot, angling the scythe blades toward the nearest champion, but the warrior leapt aside with a speed surprising for his size, bringing his axe down toward the king's horse. Senesret deflected with his khopesh just in time, sparks bursting as bronze met obsidian. Another champion rushed in, then another, and suddenly the king found himself encircled by giants who moved with predatory grace. His guard fought desperately to hold them back, but even they struggled to match the raw fury of these warriors. The battle intensified. Nubian reinforcements poured from the dunes, their numbers staggering, and for a moment the flood-filled valley became a writhing mass of bodies, blades, and roiling water. The air thick with the metallic stench of blood and the roar of men fighting for their homeland. Senusret ducked beneath an axe swing that would have taken his head, rolled from his chariot as it toppled under another blow, and landed in the swirling mud with the agility of a panther. He rose in a single motion, striking upward, the curved blade of his khopesh slicing deep into a champion's ribs. The giant roared, staggering, but did not fall. Senusret had to leap back as another axe whistled past his face, the gust of its passage, brushing his cheek like the touch of death itself. Then, above the din, Egyptian horns sounded again, this time from the cliffs. The king spared a glance upward and saw it. Reinforcements pouring down the switchback paths carved months earlier. Troops from the western forts, arriving precisely on time, summoned by mirror signals that had flashed the moment the Nubian countercharge began. Their descent sent a renewed surge of hope through the Egyptian ranks. The Nubians noticed too, and the champions redoubled their fury, trying to break the Egyptian line before the fresh forces could fully engage. Their axes swung faster, with reckless abandon. Senusret seized his moment, driving his khopesh into the wounded champion's throat, tearing it free in a crimson spray as the giant toppled. He whirled, parried another devastating strike, then lunged forward, his blade punching into the second champion's abdomen. The warrior bellowed in agony, collapsing to his knees. The remaining champions faltered, and Egyptian archers from the cliffs unleashed a searing volley of arrows that rained down with lethal accuracy, piercing exposed flesh, staggering the giants long enough for infantry to swarm them. And then the tide shifted. The Nubian center collapsed under the combined pressure of the floodwaters, the pincer movements from the forts, and the relentless push of Senusret's main force. Warriors fled, slipping in the mud, stumbling into the churning water. Some tried to regroup, others attempted to scale the valley walls. But Egyptian chariots circled, cutting off escape routes. Infantry advanced with shields interlocked. Archers fired in coordinated waves, driving the enemy back step by step. Still, the Nubians refused surrender, fighting with a desperation born of pride and generations of rivalry. Senesret respected their resolve, but he would not allow it to break his advance. He climbed onto a fallen boulder, raised his khopesh high, and shouted a command that echoed across the entire valley. "Close the trap!" At once, the sluice engineers activated the secondary gates carved into the downstream channels. The floodwaters shifted direction, sweeping behind the remaining Nubian ranks, sealing their retreat with a churning wall of river foam. Trapped between Egyptian steel and the redirected Nile, the last of the Nubian host howled defiance, then charged in a final, furious surge. Senesret met them at the front, clashing with their leader, a towering warrior whose golden torque marked him as a prince of the southern clans. Their weapons collided with thunderous force. Bronze sparks flashed. The prince's strength was monstrous, but the king's precision was unmatched. Blow after blow reverberated through the valley until, with a swift maneuver, Senesret hooked the prince's wrist with his khopesh, wrenched the axe from his grasp, and drove his blade across the man's chest in a blazing, sunlit arc. The prince fell, and with him, Nubia's final resistance crumbled. Warriors dropped their weapons, staggering back as Egyptian troops closed around them in an unbreakable ring. The valley fell silent, save for the panting of exhausted soldiers and the fading roar of redirected waters, returning gradually to controlled flow. Senesret stood amidst the ruin, his chest rising and falling, his blade dripping, the scent of victory, raw, violent, absolute, settling over him like a mantle. He looked south, toward the heartland of Nubia, and spoke softly, more to himself than to anyone present. The border is no more. His generals approached, awaiting orders. Senesret sheathed his sword. "Prepare the march," he said. "We finish this at the source." Senesret III led the army southward, deeper into lands where the Nile narrowed into winding channels and rocky cataracts that snarled the current into foaming white threads. The air grew hotter, denser, humming with insect wings, and the distant rumble of unseen herds. Yet the king felt only the accelerating pulse of inevitability as fort after fort signaled behind him in gleaming flashes of sunlight. Supply barges glided through the canals that paralleled the river like hidden veins, their movements so efficient that the Egyptian host never lacked for grain, arrows, or fresh water. This alone unnerved the southern scouts who shadowed the marching columns. For no foreign power had ever entered this land without starving. Now the Egyptians advanced like a machine of stone and bronze and water, tireless, perfectly coordinated. And the Nubians who had survived the flood trap understood that this was no campaign of plunder. This was conquest on an imperial scale, a reshaping of the world itself. Villages ahead, evacuated at the first sight of Egyptian banners, fleeing into the cliffs, leaving silent huts, abandoned hearths, and half-finished boats. But the king ordered no pursuit, no burnings, no reprisals, for such actions were beneath his purpose. He wanted the final battle to take place at the heart of Nubian unity, Kerma, the seat of their kings, a city of earth-brick palaces and towering burial mounds older than some Egyptian dynasties. If Nubia fell there, it would never rise again. The march pressed on. At night, the desert glowed red under the campfires of tens of thousands of troops, and the signal towers continued relaying orders far beyond the horizon, creating an invisible chain linking fortress to fortress until the entire frontier thrummed like the taut string of a war bow. One evening, as the army encamped near the third cataract, a scout approached Senesret with an urgency that made every guard stiffen. "Majesty," he said, dropping to one knee in the sand, "the Nubian High King himself awaits you ahead. He has fortified the valley leading to Kerma. Thousands stand with him. They prepare an ambush." Senesret did not react with concern, only with quiet satisfaction. "Good," he said. If he did not gather his strength, this conquest would be unworthy of memory. At dawn, they reached the valley. Two towering ridgelines funneled the Nile into a narrow ribbon, with sheer cliffs rising like the walls of a colossal gate. From those cliffs fluttered the standards of the united clans, colors and sigils never seen together in generations. The Nubians had gathered everything. Every one, every champion, every archer, every spearman, every surviving warband, and they waited. The king of Nubia stood at their center, a giant of a man draped in leopard hide, golden armbands glinting on his muscles, a crescent-shaped axe resting on his shoulder. His voice rolled across the valley. "Egyptian, turn back. You have broken our walls, drowned our sons, scattered our warbands, but you will go no farther. This is our land. This is where you end." Senesret rode forward, alone, his chariot wheels whispering over the sand. He raised his voice just enough. "This is where your land becomes Egypt." A roar erupted from the Nubian ranks, and then the High King gave the signal. The cliffs erupted with motion as hidden archers appeared in rows, drawing longbows of tremendous strength. The valley floor shook as war chariots surged forward, flanked by infantry formations designed to encircle and crush. It was a perfect ambush, a masterpiece of Nubian strategy, had Senesret been any other commander. But he lifted one hand, a single gesture, and from behind the Egyptian line, A deep mechanical groaning rose, like the awakening of an ancient beast beneath the earth. The Nubians faltered. Something enormous was happening behind the Egyptians, something they had not foreseen. And then it happened. Water thundered into the valley from two directions. Not natural floodwaters, but controlled torrents unleashed by temporary diversion dams the engineers had constructed. During the march, small-scale cousins of the Great Dam upriver, carved and assembled with impossible speed. The Nubians staggered as the valley floor became a shifting, unstable battlefield. The river forced sideways into artificial channels that split their formations apart. The High King roared orders, trying to maintain cohesion, but the Egyptians advanced with terrifying precision, using the unstable terrain not as a hindrance, but as a weapon. Archers fired from dry mounds, created intentionally by redirecting water. Chariots followed firm causeways built days earlier beneath deceptive layers of sand. Infantry surged across hidden stepping stone ridges carved into the bedrock. Nubians attempted countercharges, but every path they chose collapsed into mud or swirling water, because Senesret had shaped the battlefield itself. The king led from the vanguard, his chariot gliding through the controlled chaos, as though the ground bowed for him. He targeted the densest clusters of Nubian fighters, smashing their lines apart, Khopesh flashing in swift, brutal arcs. The High King saw him and charged, leaping over the churned water with the power of a lion, his axe raised to cleave the Egyptian ruler in two. Their weapons collided with an impact that sent shockwaves through the nearest ranks. The Nubian king's strength was monstrous, each swing of his axe capable of splitting a chariot pole. Senesret countered with speed and lethal precision, ducking beneath the sweeping blade, striking at exposed openings, each blow calculated to wear the giant down. Around them, the entire battle seemed to warp, the floodwaters shifting direction as engineers adjusted gates upstream, ensuring the Egyptians held the driest ground while Nubian positions drowned by inches. The two kings clashed again and again until the Nubian king seized Senesret by the throat with one massive hand, lifting him from the chariot and slamming him onto a half-submerged boulder, forcing the air from his lungs. "You cannot take our river," the Nubian king growled. "You cannot take our land." But Senesret's voice came out steady, cold, unwavering. "The river has already chosen," and with a final surge of strength, he drove his Khopesh up beneath the Nubian king's ribs, twisting hard. The giant groaned, staggered, then crumpled forward into the shallow water, staining it red. A tremor of disbelief rippled through the Nubian ranks. Their king had fallen, their formations splintered, and the Egyptians pressed harder. Archers loosed volleys that forced the remaining champions back step by step. Chariots encircled the disoriented infantry. Engineers sealed the last diversion channels, trapping Nubians on unstable mudflats that collapsed under them. Some fled upriver, others dropped their weapons, others fought to the last heartbeat, but the result was the same. By noon, the valley belonged to Egypt. By evening, the surviving clans sent messengers bearing white banners, and at dawn the next day, Senesret entered Kerma. The city did not burn. He forbade it. Instead, he stood before its great mud brick temple, gazing at the ancient incense burners, the ceremonial axes, the towering burial mounds that bore silent witness to centuries of Nubian kings. Then he raised both hands and declared with quiet authority, "From this day, the lands of Kush are part of Kemet. Its people will live under Egypt's protection. Its river will flow with Egypt's strength. Its future will rise with ours." And as the sun climbed over the horizon, gilding the city in gold, the conquest was complete. Senesret remained in Kerma for 3 days, not as a plunderer, but as a sculptor, studying the raw stone from which he would carve a new reality. The conquered city was tense, its streets hushed, its people watching from doorways with wary eyes that held grief and fury and unspoken questions. Yet they did not resist, for the battle in the valley had broken not only their armies, but the very certainty that the Nile south of Egypt belonged exclusively to them. The king moved through the city with measured steps, observing its fortifications, its storehouses, its ceremonial complexes, and the sprawling Defufa whose ancient walls rose like a mountain of earth and memory. He noted how the Nubians built upward, how they shaped clay into monuments that endured centuries of wind and flood, and he envisioned what Egyptian stone, precision, and divine authority could add to these foundations. On the fourth morning, he summoned his generals, engineers, and scribes into the courtyard of the captured palace, where the air was heavy with incense, and the shadows of tall columns stretched across the sand in long, sharp lines. "The conquest," Senesret said, his voice carrying with effortless command, "is not won by battles. It is won by permanence." He ordered the construction of a new fort directly beside Kerma, larger than any before it, an anchor that would lock Egypt's southern frontier firmly into place. Canals would be extended around the city, like arteries, their waters controlled by gates that responded to signals from upriver. Watchtowers would rise along the horizon, each linked to the next in a chain of mirrored vigilance. And most importantly, Nubian laborers willing, not forced, would be paid to assist, binding them to the prosperity the new order would bring. Messengers rushed to deliver these commands to the engineers, who had proven themselves geniuses of earth and water. They set to work immediately, surveying the land, marking the floodplains, measuring the bedrock with rods, and within hours, the first hammer strikes rang out across the valley. Meanwhile, Senesret called for an audience with the elders of Kerma. They arrived with pride still burning in their eyes, wearing robes dyed in the deep reds and blues of their traditions, their faces painted with ochre symbols that spoke of lineage older than Egypt's borders. They knelt by custom, not submission. One elder, her voice cracked with age and iron, spoke, "Why must Kush bend its knee to Kemet? Why must our sons die for the ambitions of a foreign throne?" Senesret regarded her with respect, but without softness. "Because the river demands unity," he said. "Your people have lived by its bounty for generations. So have mine. But divided, we bleed each other. United, we can command the river's full power. With my forts, your trade will flourish. With my canals, your floods will nourish rather than destroy. With my armies, your enemies will fear to rise." He paused. "I do not ask you to abandon who you are. I ask you to become greater." The elders exchanged long, weighted glances. They did not embrace him. They did not thank him, but neither did they reject him. And that was enough. Over the following weeks, Kerma changed. Egyptian artisans arrived to carve stone reliefs beside Nubian murals, creating a new hybrid artistry where falcons soared above cattle lords and lotus flowers intertwined with desert lilies. Soldiers patrolled the streets, but did so alongside Nubian auxiliaries, weaving the two forces together into a single disciplined unit. Traders from the oases and far western deserts came cautiously at first, then more willingly, bringing incense, copper, ivory, and oils. The people watched, wary yet curious, as the first blocks of the new fortress were lowered into place with ropes and wooden cranes, forming a geometric bastion that would stand longer than any dynasty. Yet beneath this blossoming stability, Senesret sensed movement shadows stirring in the hills, messages traveling by hidden paths, rumors that survivors from the united Nubian army refused to accept defeat. A new leader had risen among them, a warrior priest named the Kiri, renowned for walking alone into a lion's den and emerging with the beast's mane wrapped around his arm. The Kiri claimed visions from the ancient gods of Kush, proclaiming that the Nile was furious, that Egypt's mastery had disrupted the river's sacred breathing, and that the only path forward was war, war to the death, war to cleanse the land of foreign influence. Reports placed him gathering followers far to the south, beyond the Fourth Cataract, in lands untouched by Egypt's reach, and his numbers were growing. Senesret heard these whispers and felt no fear, only the familiar thrum of anticipation. A single victory, no matter how brilliant, was never the end of an empire's work. He convened his generals again, outlining the next phase, a campaign beyond Kerma, deeper into territories Egypt had never before dared to control. To rule the river, he said, we must follow it to its farthest bend. The army mobilized with renewed vigor. Yet before they departed, something unexpected occurred. A delegation of Nubian youths approached the Egyptian camp, offering themselves as scouts and intermediaries to the southern clans. They believed Thakiri's path would lead to ruin, not renewal, and they sought to prevent their homeland from drowning in another generation of conflict. Senesret studied their faces proud, determined, unbroken, and saw in them the future he had envisioned, where Nubia and Egypt stood not as master and subject, but as partners in a shared dominion. He accepted their allegiance, granted them Egyptian training and weapons, and integrated them into the army as the first official Kushite auxiliaries. With their guidance, the march resumed. The terrain grew harsher, as they advanced no longer gentle floodplains or fertile valleys, but jagged gorges, boulder-strewn riverbanks, and cliffs that forced the Nile to twist into violent cataracts. Yet Egyptian engineering adapted. Temporary dams diverted dangerous currents. Ropes and pulleys hauled boats over rocky outcroppings. Soldiers carved footholds into cliff sides. And the Nubian auxiliaries, light-footed as ibex, scouted ahead, identifying ambush points, hidden ravines, and water caches. After weeks of relentless progress, they reached the southern frontier of Thakiri's domain. The land had changed ominous, quiet, the villages deserted, the fields overgrown, as though the earth itself held its breath. Then they found the first markers. Lion skulls impaled on spears, arranged in a circle around a stone altar, blackened with ritual fire. He prepares for blood rites, one auxiliary said. He believes he must bind his soul to the ancient spirits before facing you. Senesret studied the display without expression. Then we face him before the spirits answer. The final approach to the Kiri's stronghold was the most treacherous, yet a valley where the cliffs pressed inward like the jaws of a crocodile. The river surging violently beside a narrow strip of land, barely wide enough for two men to walk abreast. But as the Egyptian vanguard entered the pass, they sensed movement above, soft as shifting sand. Then the sky darkened. A cascade of boulders thundered down from the cliffs, hurled by unseen hands. The army reacted instantly. Shields raised, horns blaring, troops diving aside as rocks shattered against the earth. From the ridges erupted, Thakiri's warriors lean, painted in ash and crimson. Their bodies adorned with lion hides, their faces masked with snarling gilded jaws. They leapt down the cliffs with terrifying agility, wielding obsidian blades that flickered like living flame. The ambush was ferocious. Egyptian soldiers scrambled to form lines in the cramped terrain, but the narrow jaws, as the Kiri's warriors were called, struck with the precision of predators, targeting officers, engineers, and standard-bearers. A dozen auxiliaries were cut down in the first wave. Senesret charged into the fray, his khopesh flashing as he cut a path toward the ridge from which the main assault descended. Above him, a tall figure in full lion-skin cloak raised a ceremonial staff carved from ivory, its tip burning with blue flame. Thakiri himself. His voice boomed across the pass, amplified by some trick of the cliffs. "Egypt has chained the river! The spirits rage! Today the Nile devours you!" The warriors howled and surged again. But Senesret lifted his free hand, and far behind the army, engineers who had been waiting for this exact signal drove iron wedges into the rock walls. The cliffs trembled. Massive stone slabs, pre-weakened by weeks of quiet chiseling, collapsed inward, not onto the Egyptian forces, but onto the side paths Thakiri's warriors used, cutting their routes, sealing their reinforcements away, and blocking their escape. Thakiri roared in fury as his trap backfired. Senesret pointed directly at him. "Face me. No spirits? No cliffs? Just you and me." Thakiri leapt down, landing with the force of a falling tree, obsidian blades drawn. Their duel erupted like a lightning strike in the center of the battlefield. The king of Egypt and the lion priest of Kush circling each other amid dust, echoes, and the crash of combat, each blow illuminating the valley with fire-bright sparks. Thakiri fought like a storm, his movements wild yet deliberate, his blades spinning in brutal arcs meant to overwhelm. Senesret countered with discipline, precision, economy of motion. Thakiri's strength shook him. His own speed staggered Thakiri. Back and forth they clashed, until Thakiri fainted, ducked low, and slammed into Senesret with the full weight of his body, knocking him to the ground. The lion priest raised both blades for the killing strike. "The river rejects you," he snarled. Senesret thrust upward at the same moment, driving his khopesh straight into Thakiri's chest. The lion priest froze. Blood blossomed across his painted skin. He collapsed forward, his blades dropping harmlessly into the sand. When he fell, the narrow jaws faltered. Their battle cries broke. Their lines collapsed. And within minutes, the pass fell silent, save for the groan of dying men and the steady thunder of the Nile beside them. Senesret stood over Thakiri's body, breathing hard, his chest streaked with dust and sweat and blood. "The river does not reject order," he said softly. "It becomes stronger." With Thakiri dead, the last resistance dissolved. The southern clans sent envoys begging terms, and Senesret granted them with the same measured firmness he offered. Kerma, cooperation, stability, prosperity, and a place within an empire that now stretched farther south than any Egyptian map had ever dared to show. When the army returned north months later, the forts were complete. The canals brimmed with controlled water. The great dam stood unmoving, master of the river's pulse. And Senesret III became not merely a conqueror of lands, but a shaper of geography. A king who bent rivers, mountains, and nations into alignment with his will. The cycle of raids ended. Trade flourished. Egypt entered an age of unprecedented security. And the world would remember this as the moment the southern frontier ceased to be a border and became the beating heart of an empire. Senesret's return through the chain of forts was nothing like the triumphant marches of kings celebrated in temple reliefs. There was no revelry, no parades, no musicians lining the canals. The soldiers were too exhausted, the engineers too focused, the auxiliaries too solemn after witnessing the death of their own lion priest. Instead, the procession moved like an immense, steady tide, measured, purposeful, respectful of the enormity of what had been achieved and what still lay ahead. For conquest was only the first phase. Transformation was the second. And Senesret III understood that the latter required far more patience, foresight, and resolve than any battlefield victory. At the first fortress, the army reached Semna. The jewel of his frontier chain, the garrison, erupted in disciplined salutes as the king crossed the drawbridge. The fort had grown since he last passed through. New granaries, barracks, and signal towers stood proudly atop its walls, the stones still pale from recent chiseling. And for the first time, Nubian auxiliaries manned the parapets alongside Egyptian archers. Senesret noted this with a brief nod of satisfaction. Nubia was no longer merely subdued, it was integrating. That evening, the fort's commanders gathered in the war hall, an austere chamber carved into the inner wall, where maps of the entire southern frontier were etched directly into the limestone. Lanterns cast wavering gold light across the reliefs, illuminating the network of forts, canals, diversion dams, and watchtowers that now pulsed with synchronized order. Senesret stood before the map and placed one hand on the southernmost marker. "This border is no longer a line," he said. "It is a system, a machine, and a machine must be maintained." He commanded a series of sweeping reforms, permanent engineer guilds assigned to each canal, rotating mixed patrols of Egyptians and Nubians. A new code of river law determining how water was to be shared, rationed, and protected. Fortified depots storing emergency grain reserves in case of drought, and a strict structural check of all dams every 8 days. If the river is harnessed, he said, it must never be taken for granted. Over the next weeks, Senesret traveled the entire frontier, inspecting each fort personally. At Mergissa, he observed archers firing coordinated volleys at moving targets carried by the current. At Euronardi, he tested the rapid mirror relay system by issuing a command that reached 5 forts in less than 400 heartbeats. At Kuma, he watched Nubian and Egyptian soldiers drilling side by side, adjusting formations to accommodate the strengths of each culture. Nubian agility and long-range precision, combined with Egyptian discipline and shield tactics. Every improvement, every innovation, every fused technique was logged by scribes, becoming the blueprint for a frontier unlike any other in the world. But the most critical test came at the Great Dam itself. When Senesret arrived, its vast face stretched across the Nile like the spine of a god, its colossal stones interlocked with such precision that not even a knife blade could wedge between them. The upstream reservoir shimmered under the sun, its waters patiently awaiting the king's command. Engineers rushed to meet him, anxious yet proud. "Majesty," said Anku, chief architect of the entire hydraulic project, "we have prepared a demonstration of the dam's full capabilities." Senesret stepped onto the observation platform as dozens of workers positioned ropes, levers, counterweights, and signal flags. Anku raised a hand. "Open the primary sluice." The ground vibrated as a controlled roar erupted from deep within the structure. A massive column of water surged from the dam's sunken mouth, carving a perfect channel downstream. The force was immense, enough to sweep away an invading army or nourish thousands of acres of farmland, depending on how the gate was angled. "Increase flow by 1/4, Anku commanded. The water thickened, white caps forming along its spine. "Half," Senesret ordered. The torrent doubled, the sound rising into thunder. Birds took flight along the riverbanks. Engineers gripped their ropes tightly as mist soaked the platform. "Enough," Senesret said, and at once the flow tapered, narrowing like the stroke of a pen, until it returned to a steady, obedient stream. "Test the secondary gates." One by one, controlled flows diverted into canals, each adjusted by precise increments. The water obeyed, completely. Senesret felt the magnitude of it settling over him like the weight of a crown, but one forged from water rather than gold. "With this," he murmured, "Egypt rules the seasons." Yet mastery of the river brought new challenges. Reports arrived of unexplained disturbances along the frontier, signal flashes that did not match any known code, barges found adrift with no crew, scouts disappearing near ravines where the cliffs were carved with unfamiliar symbols. Rumors whispered of a remnant faction, loyal to Thakiri, calling themselves the Voiceless Flood Warriors, sworn to sabotage the dams and return the Nile to chaos as tribute to the river spirits angered by Egyptian interference. At first, Senesret dismissed these as the superstitions of frightened villagers. But then came the message that changed everything. A runner from the 6th fort arrived half dead, collapsing before the king with sand-encrusted lips and eyes wide with terror. "Majesty," he gasped. "They breached the canal, diverted the water. Hundreds. They call the river a weapon." He seized Senesret's wrist with a shaking hand. "They say they have learned your methods." Senesret's jaw tightened. The idea of his own hydraulic strategies turned against him was intolerable. That night, he summoned the frontier's brightest engineers, cartographers, and intelligence officers. They gathered in a narrow stone chamber, lit only by oil lamps and the flicker of torches. On the central table lay a map of the widened southern frontier, updated, detailed, and covered with new red markings representing attacks, sightings, and water disruptions. Anku spoke first. "Majesty, the Voiceless Flood understands the principles of flow manipulation. They have targeted weak points, temporary canals, unfinished diversion basins, sluice gates not yet reinforced. They are not trying to destroy the dam. They are trying to break the system, a general added. They strike at night, vanish before dawn. They use small, fast teams. They are not an army, they are a shadow. Senesret's eyes narrowed. Then we will bring them into the light. And so began the Great Consolidation Campaign. A silent war fought not on open battlefields, but in ravines, canals, river caves, and cliff shadows. Egypt mobilized special detachments, trained to fight in water-saturated terrain. Nubian auxiliaries served as trackers, reading footprints in mud, deciphering smudged ash symbols, interpreting broken reeds and river patterns. Small skirmishes erupted across the southern frontier. Canal walls were patched, broken sluices repaired. Scout teams deployed in rotating cycles to prevent ambush patterns. One night, an entire Egyptian patrol vanished near a canyon known as the Teeth of Sobek. When a second team investigated, they found the canyon flooded beyond natural levels, an intentional drowning. Senesret arrived himself the next day to inspect the site. The cliffs were carved with new symbols, stylized waves, broken chains, a mouth swallowing the sun. Messages, warnings, defiance. He studied them carefully, then turned to Anku. "Tell me," he said quietly, "if you wish to hide a sabotage network using water as your ally, where would you build it?" Anku hesitated, then gestured southward. "Majesty, there are ancient grottos carved by thousands of years of seasonal flooding tunnels beneath the cliffs, caverns where the river once flowed before shifting. If the voiceless flood uses those tunnels, then they have created a secret Nile." Senesret finished. "One I cannot see." "Not yet," Anku said. "But we can change that. Over the next month." The king personally commanded reconnaissance into the subterranean river tunnels. Dangerous missions where soldiers navigated darkness lit only by oil lamps, water up to their hips, always aware that any misstep could trigger a collapse. They found traps. They found sigils. They found evidence of gatherings. But no warriors, no leaders. The voiceless flood remained a phantom until the night of the broken mirror. A signal tower lit its beacon in the dead of night, then abruptly went dark. When riders arrived, they found the tower abandoned, the mirrors shattered, the garrison missing. Only a single message was carved at the base of the signal mount. "You cannot command what was never yours." Senesret stood before the carving, lit by torches that sputtered in the wind. 100 by Carden, 100 by Carden, 100 by Carden, 100 by Carden, 100 by Carden. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, with a calmness that chilled even his generals, he issued a single command. "We flood the tunnels." Anku blinked. "Majesty, if we do that, the cliffs may collapse. Villages nearby. We divert the water." Senesret clarified. "We control the flow. We flush them out." And so Egypt unleashed the most complex hydraulic maneuver ever attempted. Water from the dam was redistributed through a network of minor canals, redirected underground through newly carved spillways, and channeled into the forgotten tunnels. The earth rumbled, the cliffs shuddered, and slowly, methodically, the hidden caverns filled. The first bodies surfaced by dawn warriors carried by the current, their masks waterlogged, their weapons drifting in the eddies. But far more emerged alive, drenched, furious, cornered, and they fought. The battle that followed was unlike any other. Skirmishes erupting along cliff ledges, warriors slipping in mud, slick with water and blood, combatants wrestling in swirling currents, arrows hissing over water channels. Senesret fought at the front, cutting down masked saboteurs who lunged from flooded tunnels, the roar of water blending with the clash of bronze. And then they found him the leader of the voiceless flood. Not a warrior wreathed in lion skin, not a priest anointed in ash. A boy, barely 16, thin as a reed, eyes blazing. He was the last surviving disciple of the Kiri. And when they cornered him on a narrow ledge above a roaring spillway, he screamed, "You poisoned the river. You broke the sacred flow. It will never obey you." Senesret stared at him, not with anger, with something far colder. "The river obeys balance," he said. "You are the one who broke it." The boy tried to leap into the spillway to join the current he worshipped, but Senesret seized his wrist with brutal precision, yanked him back, and held him firmly. "Enough," the king said. "No more drowning." The boy's strength collapsed. The rebellion ended. The tunnels fell silent, and the frontier, at last, stabilized. In the years that followed, the forts thrived. Trade routes blossomed. Mixed communities formed. The river flowed not with chaos, but with regulated abundance. And Senesret III, who had conquered not only the land but the very heartbeat of the Nile, stood atop the great dam one last time. As the sun set in molten gold, Anku approached quietly. "Majesty, the system is complete." Senesret watched the water shimmer. "No," he said, "it has just begun." For the river, like empire, was eternal only when guided, never forced. And thanks to him, Egypt now guided both. Senesret descended from the dam that evening, with the aura of someone who had looked not only into the future, but into the architecture that would hold that future in place, a lattice of water and stone that would outlive even memory if tended properly. Yet beneath his satisfaction ran a current of unease, subtle but insistent, like the faint tug of an undertow beneath calm waters. The voiceless flood had been defeated, yes, but defeated enemies did not vanish. They dissolved into the river of history, sometimes resurfacing in shapes no one predicted. The boy leader was held in a fortified chamber within the 11th fort, where priests attempted to unravel the source of his devotion to chaos. He spoke little, ate little, and spent hours staring at the canal, visible through the narrow slits in the wall as if communicating with the water itself. Senesret intended to speak to him personally, but before that he had another mission: to integrate the frontier into Egypt's civic and economic body. It was one thing to conquer land. It was another to make the land indispensable. He summoned caravans of architects, scribes, tax officials, artisans, and surveyors. They swarmed across the frontier like ants building a colossal nest. New towns rose beside the forts, each arranged with geometric precision around communal wells fed by the regulated canals. Farmers received plots of irrigated land in exchange for maintaining sections of the canal walls. Workshops specialized in copper tools, stone masonry, bow making, papyrus production, and pottery, creating an economic network that fed the forts while exporting goods northward to Thebes. But the greatest innovation came from a Nubian woman named Shayna, a former scout who had proven invaluable during the tunnel reconnaissance. She approached Senesret with a radical idea: a system of raised platforms built along the canals where market stalls could operate even during seasonal adjustments of water level. "Merchants fear sudden changes," she explained plainly. "If the water rises or falls, they lose their place. If we lift the stalls above the flow, trade will continue no matter what the canal does." Senesret considered her proposal carefully. It was simple, elegant, and symbolic, the perfect fusion of Egyptian stability and Nubian adaptability. "Build them," he said, "and put your name on the first." Over time, these elevated markets became bustling centers where Egyptians and Nubians bartered in equal measure. Grain, ivory, copper, leather, honey, incense, and river fish flowed like tributaries through the marketplace, creating a cultural exchange as vital as the water channels themselves. And with prosperity came allegiance. Soon, villages that once feared Egyptian expansion petitioned to join the water network voluntarily, offering tribute in exchange for regulated irrigation. The frontier transformed from a conquered region into a thriving border ecosystem, half military, half civilian, fully interdependent. But harmony did not breed complacency for Senesret. He knew better than any ruler that systems failed not from outside threats alone, but from internal cracks, the kind that spread slowly beneath the surface until the entire structure groaned under its own weight. He sensed one such crack the day he finally visited the boy. The chamber was dim, illuminated only by a shaft of orange afternoon light. The boy sat against the far wall, knees drawn to his chest, thin arms resting atop them. His eyes tracked Senesret's movements with unsettling calm. "Do you know who I am?" Senesret asked. "You are the one who binds things that should not be bound," the boy answered quietly. "The river, the land, the people, even time. You knot them like ropes. I order them," Senesret corrected. "There is a difference. To you," the boy said. "But the river remembers its freedom." Senesret stepped closer. "Tell me your name." "Names are for those who belong to something," the boy replied. "I belong to the river's truth." The king folded his arms. "The river's truth is balance. Without balance, everything drowns." The boy lifted his head sharply. "Balance is not control." His voice cracked through the chamber like the snap of a taut cord. "You speak of balance, but what you have built is a cage, and cages always break. When they do, the thing inside tears itself apart, or tears apart everything around it." Senesret studied him. The boy was not mad. He was convinced. Fanatic belief, when paired with intelligence, was a danger far greater than any physical weapon. "If you believe the river will punish me," Senesret said calmly, "then why did the river fail you? I flushed your tunnels. I destroyed your sanctuaries. Your people scattered like sand." The boy smiled faintly, a chilling expression of someone who sees beyond the present moment. "You destroyed only the parts you could see." Senesret's pulse tightened. "Explain." But the boy said nothing more. Eventually, Senesret left, more troubled than when he entered. That night, he pored over every report from the forts. Nothing unusual, no uprisings, no disruptions, only routine patrols, routine construction updates, routine shifts in water output. Routine sometimes was the first sign of deception. In the following weeks, a disquiet settled over the southern frontier. Not open unrest, not rebellion, not violence, just a strange quietness. Birds migrated earlier than expected. Fish schools changed their patterns. Farmers reported odd sediment buildup near one of the lesser canals, though engineers found nothing wrong. At the 13th, watchtower signals seemed to lag by a fraction of a heartbeat, though mirrors were perfectly aligned. Small anomalies. Tiny misalignments, harmless individually. But together they formed a shadowy constellation that Senesret could not ignore. He increased inspections, doubled patrol rotations, tripled engineer surveys, yet nothing surfaced. Until the night the river fell silent. It was Anku who burst into the king's quarters just before dawn, chest heaving, eyes wide with terror Senesret had never seen in the man. "Majesty," he gasped. "The dam, the river, the flow has slowed." Senesret rose sharply. "Impossible! The gates are open." "Wide open," Anku said. "And yet the water its force has diminished. It is as though the river itself is being strangled before it reaches us." Senesret strode from his chambers, gathering his cloak as he moved. Minutes later, he was galloping toward the great dam with an escort of guards, the rising sun casting long shadows across the frontier. When he reached the dam, he felt it instantly. The roar was gone. Water still flowed, but weakly, pitifully, like a sick animal struggling to breathe. Engineers scrambled over the stone, shouting measurements, hauling ropes, checking channels. Anku approached with a clay tablet scratched with emergency calculations. "Majesty, the reservoir remains full. The problem is upstream. Something is obstructing the main channel. Senesret stared at him. A natural obstruction? This is no natural pattern, Anku said. The flow decline is too precise. Senesret's mind raced. Show me the maps. They unfurled the upstream surveys, charts of floodplains, seasonal variance, soil densities. And then they saw it, a region upstream marked years ago as unstable, full of ancient silt dunes and collapsed riverbeds. A region no one had visited since the beginning of the hydraulic campaign. A perfect hiding place. Senesret's mouth hardened. Saddle the horses, gather the scouts, and bring the boy. Majesty? Anku asked, startled. I want him to see what his river has become, Senesret said. And I want him to tell me how he damaged it without ever touching the dam. For the first time since the conquest began, the enemy was not visible. The enemy was not an army. The enemy was not human at all. It was the river, or something hidden within it, and Senesret would confront it before the frontier he built began to unravel piece by piece like the fraying edges of a net pulled too taut. Senesret rode at the head of the column with the boy bound to a separate horse, flanked by guards who watched him with a mixture of fear and fascination, for his presence seemed to whisper of omens no priest dared name. The air thickened as they advanced upstream, the landscape tightening into narrow, river-worn passages and cliffs that leaned inward like listening giants. The river beside them crawled sluggishly, its surface eerily flat, as though stripped of breath. Birds circled in uneasy spirals overhead, their cries sharp and discordant. Even the wind seemed hesitant, brushing past reeds with a brittle rustle instead of its usual flowing sigh. Hours passed before they reached the region last surveyed years before, a wasteland of tangled roots and ancient stone where the river's path shifted constantly over centuries. It was a place forgotten by all but time, a labyrinth of exposed mudflats and abandoned channels. The main river here had narrowed to a strangled corridor between steep banks. Senesret dismounted and approached the water's edge. What he saw tightened something deep in his chest. A faint reddish stain, thin but unmistakable, swirling like diluted ink beneath the surface. What is that? He asked, kneeling. Anku dipped his hand into the water and rubbed the residue between his fingers. His expression darkened. Clay, but not from here. Someone has redirected a massive source of clay-rich runoff into the river, enough to thicken the flow like blood. Senesret turned sharply to the boy. Is this your doing? The boy did not answer at first. Then he met the king's gaze with disturbing tranquility. We did not touch your dam. We touched the river's memories. Explain, Senesret demanded. The river flows not only through land, the boy said, but through stories, loyalties, promises. You think it obeys only gates and stone? We found the old beds, the forgotten veins. We whispered to the land, broke open the places where the river once mourned its own entrapment. Senesret grabbed him by the tunic and jerked him forward. You poisoned it. We reminded it, the boy corrected, unblinking. Anku gestured urgently. Majesty, come. You need to see this. They followed him upstream on foot until they reached the point where the riverbed split a fork that should not have existed. The right branch led to the main river. The left, however, was new. A fresh channel gouged into the earth with startling precision, reinforced with wooden braces and stone bulwarks. Water diverted into it in a slow, steady siphon, disappearing into a dark cleft between cliffs. Senesret knelt and inspected the walls of the artificial channel. They were cut with tools, sharp ones. Not the rough hacking of desperate saboteurs, the meticulous carving of engineers. These are our methods, Senesret growled. Our tools, our angles, our measurements. Anku's voice was hollow. Someone studied our designs carefully, very carefully. Senesret rose, 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 rose. We follow the diversion. They entered the cleft, single file, torches sputtering in the damp air. The new channel burrowed deep between the cliffs before descending into a cavern whose ceiling dripped with the slow patience of centuries. The faint veil of reddish clay thickened here, turning the water murky. As they advanced, the cavern widened into an enormous subterranean basin, and when Senesret stepped through the narrow bottleneck of rock, the sight before him made even his steadfast heart falter. A lake, artificial, vast, fed entirely by the diverted river, held back by a dam not built by Egyptians, but by the voiceless flood. A dam constructed of massive boulders, mud bricks, and timber braces arranged in a lattice eerily similar to the earliest Egyptian prototypes, though twisted and crude, like an imitation studied from afar. But the most terrifying part was not its size, it was the pressure. The entire structure shuddered under the weight of the trapped water behind it. It was unstable, deliberately unstable. A weapon waiting to be unleashed. Anku whispered, "If that dam breaks, the flood will tear through the old river channels, the new canals, the towns, everything. It will undo all we built." Senesret stared at it with a grim, icy clarity. "This is no sabotage," he said. "This is war by water." At that moment, the boy laughed for the first time, a soft, unsettling sound that echoed across the cavern. "Do you understand now?" he said. "You forced the river into your shape. We simply gave it a choice." Senesret's eyes hardened. "The river chooses life. You choose destruction." "Destruction is part of life," the boy whispered. "Every flood teaches that." Senesret pointed to the unstable dam. "If this bursts, thousands will die, your own people among them." "Sacrifice is the river's language," the boy murmured. "We speak it fluently." Senesret motioned to his engineers. "We need to stabilize it." "Majesty, we don't have the materials," Anku said. "Or the time." The dam gave a low groan, like the grinding teeth of a colossus. Water seeped through its seams in thin, mocking streams. Senesret turned to Anku. "Options." The architect swallowed hard. "We could open controlled breaches along the side, divert the pressure before it collapses. But, we would need to be in the water," Anku said, "close to the structure. If it gives way early," Senesret understood, "they would be crushed or swept away." He looked at his soldiers, men who had marched with him through deserts, fought in canyons, survived ambushes in flooded tunnels. And without hesitation, he said, "Prepare to enter the water." Anku grabbed his arm. "Majesty, you cannot. I can, and I will," Senesret said. "The pharaoh does not command from safety." They waded into the cold water, the current pulling at their legs like pleading hands. The cavern filled with the sounds of scraping stone, shifting timber, shouted measurements. Anku directed teams to carve secondary channels along the base of the left cavern wall. Others hammered wedges into cracks to slow leakage. Senesret himself dragged boulders into place, muscles burning with the strain. Each moment felt borrowed. Each breath was a gamble. The dam groaned louder. A deep, resonant sound, the voice of imminent ruin. A crack raced across its surface, jagged as lightning. "Faster!" Senesret bellowed. Engineers dug furiously, creating a narrow escape channel. Water surged into it, swirling violently, but redirecting some of the pressure. Another crack, deafening. Anku shouted, "Majesty, we need one more breach or it will collapse." Senesret seized a stone mallet. "Where?" Anku pointed. There, 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 there. Anku. But it must be precise. Before he could finish, the boy's voice rang across the cavern. "You still do not understand." He had broken free of his guards, sprinting toward the failing structure.
It wants to be free.
Senesret lunged after him, but the boy was already climbing the lower stones of the makeshift dam.
Stop!
Senesret roared. The boy reached the upper brace, spread his arms, and screamed a single word that echoed with manic devotion. Remember! Then he slammed his foot against the weakest point. The dam exploded. Water erupted with the force of a charging god, swallowing the boy instantly, shattering stone, obliterating timber supports. The shockwave slammed into Senesret, hurling him backward into the torrent. Everything became chaos. Roaring water, spinning debris, darkness, swallowing light. The current dragged him like a rag through the cavern, smashing him against walls, tumbling him into whirlpools, pulling him deeper and deeper until his breath fled and the world blurred. He felt consciousness slipping until a hand seized his wrist. Anku, the architect's grip was iron. With impossible effort, he pulled Senesret toward the escape channel their engineers had carved. They were sucked through it, like arrows shot from a bow, expelled from the cavern into the open air as the flood erupted behind them, a geyser of earth and water ripping through the cliffs. They crashed onto a mudbank downstream, gasping, trembling, alive. The artificial dam was gone. The voiceless flood was gone. But the unleashed torrent was now racing toward the frontier. Senesret staggered to his feet, soaked and shivering. "Riders!" he shouted hoarsely. "Warn the forts! Open every sluice, every canal! Divert everything!" Anku rose, coughing. "Majesty, it will be close." Senesret looked at the horizon where dust plumes already rose as the flood thundered north. "Then we will be closer." He mounted his horse, pain radiating through his body, but his voice was steady. "Ride." And as they raced the flood back toward the frontier, Senesret understood that this was the true test, not of conquest, not of engineering, but of whether an empire could outrun the consequences of its own mastery.